Rahalia. Welcome to the Center for Indigenous Midwifery's podcast. Our mission is strengthening community by honoring, supporting, and reclaiming Indigenous midwifery care and culturally centered family support. For more information on our programming, visit indigenous-midwifery.org, find us on social media, or tune in for a live Zoomcast offered each month. Thank you so much for listening.
Hello, my name is Aiyana Sanchez. I'm super honored to be here. I am 26 years old and I have 3 children. My oldest is 5, I have a 3-year-old, and then I just had my youngest baby and she is 4 months old. I am a Chehalis and Nisqually descendant, as well as being a descendant of Tsimshian and Chemamis, Canadian Indian grandparents. I am a student. I am in school full time. And yeah. So I was asked to talk about my birth experiences with all my children. I had my first daughter when I was 21 years old. I was a single mother. I had legitimately no knowledge of what I was doing or what I was getting myself into. I had moved back in with my parents and had lost my job. My 95 Honda Civic had just gotten stolen. I had nothing going for me, but I'm the oldest of 4 siblings. I come from a very big family, and the fact that I made it to 20 before getting pregnant, astonishing. It was huge for my family that I did not be a teen mom like my mom and her mom and her mom and all my other grandparents and all my aunties and uncles. And so, I already had that going for me. And surprisingly, despite my dysfunctional relationship with my parents, leading up to the moments of, the situation I had gotten myself into, my mom was so incredibly supportive. She was my number one right-hand man through it all. And I was the oldest of 4. So I was like, my mom can really help me and support me through this. And she did. But the problem was my mom had incredibly different birthing experiences than I did. She just popped them out one after another. It came so naturally for her and her body. But for me, I remember with my daughter, I was laying in bed. I had just gotten home from a movie and I was having like a lot of back pain, like lower back pain. I thought it was because I was sitting in the movie theater seat for too long, or maybe I was constipated again because, that happens when pregnant. And I didn't think much of it. I told my mom and I was like, hey, my back's really hurting. She told me to take a bath. I took a bath. It still wasn't really going away, but I didn't have like contractions. So I didn't think anything of it until I was laying in bed and I hear this loud pop. And like, I'm anxious as is. So already I'm like jumping to worst case scenario. Google's telling me, oh my gosh, your baby dislocated her shoulder. It was awful. And so after like half an hour of just laying there being like, oh, what just happened? My mom's asleep at this point. It's like 2, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning. Like not a good time. I finally stand up and just water gushes out and I freak out. I'm like, what just happened? Did I pee myself? So I like grab like a towel next to my bed and like shove it between my legs and I waddle to the bathroom and it wouldn't stop. And so finally I go and I wake up my mom and I'm like, Mom, I think my water broke, but like it keeps going. And it's like 4 o'clock in the morning at this point. She goes, yeah, it's gonna do that. She goes, let's go to the hospital. So we go to the hospital. And that was wild. I don't have pants on. I don't have underwear on. I just have like a towel wrapped around me. And I walk in, I'm like, sorry, I got water all over your floor. And they're like, you're fine. They're calling labor and delivery. This is in Olympia, Washington, just for context. There weren't many options for me as to like where to go in this moment. So immediately I go into the hospital and they're like surrounding me and like hooking me up to things and like doing vitals on me and baby. And I'm just like not sure what's going on. But my mom is with me. So I'm like, okay, this should be fine. And, I had already known that I was positive for group B strep or whatever it's called. And so they like start an IV, and just as quick as everybody came in to set everything up, everybody leaves. And I'm just like, hey, what now? And come to find out, I can't eat, I can't drink anything. They won't let me have anything. And I'm like, what the hell? It's like at this point, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, what do you mean I can't eat? Like I didn't understand, and they didn't really give me a valid answer as to why. And that was a trend in my experience going to the hospital, was there was no transparency or communication. I had been receiving my care from, I think at the time it was still group health, from Kaiser. And the OB comes over and she's like, hey, how you doing? And she like takes a look at everything and she's like, you're not really having contractions. And so my mom and I like walked around the hospital. I ended up being in labor for over 24 hours before I could before anything really happened. And because it was over 24 hours, they were starting to get really impatient with me. They're like, okay, come on, you need to hurry it up or whatever. And I remember like they were pushing this, getting an epidural, starting Pitocin and getting things going. And I didn't know much about what I wanted for my birth, but I knew I wanted it all natural because my mom never had an epidural. So I was like, I can do it. I can be a strong, stoic, Indian woman. I got this. And I did. I was just, I was hanging out. I was singing musicals and watching Netflix on my iPad. And it wasn't like horrifically awful. Despite like my water have been broken, I had heard that once the water breaks, it's so much worse, but I wasn't progressing like they wanted me to. They were getting really impatient. They didn't like that I had like the group B strep and my water was broken and it was like a risk for an infection. By like 30 something hours, I was still at 3 centimeters. So this whole time I've been at 3 centimeters, like going into like 30 hours. By 26 hours or 27 hours, I had gotten like a shot, like into my IV. Nobody told me what it was. They're just like, it'll take the edge off. And in full transparency, at the moment, I was in recovery from, drug and alcohol abuse. And it was a big reason why I didn't want anything. And I just remember I felt it. And it was really hard. And I felt really guilty. Like I had done something really bad to my baby. Because I felt like I shouldn't have had a narcotic experience in my labor. But it worked. It took the edge off. I wasn't in pain anymore. After it had worn off, we're pushing into like 30 something hours, and they said, you're still at 3 centimeters. You're not progressing. So either you get Pitocin or you get a C-section. And those were my only options, or so I thought. I truly thought that I was stuck between, I have to get an epidural and not have the birth that I want, or I have to go through even more worse trauma and get a C-section. And I didn't want a C-section. So they give me the epidural. And at this point, my contractions are just back to back to back to back. And they had allowed my mom to sit in front of me and like hold my hands. And she kept telling me to like sit still and like quit moving, the anesthesiologist. And my mom's like, what do you mean she's having a contraction? They start bickering. It was great. But I was so terrified to have this experience. And she's like giving me a hard time because I'm also having a contraction while she's trying to, granted, stick a needle in my spine. But it was really scary because nobody walked me through what was going to happen. There was no, we're going to do this and that and the other. It was just, okay, let's get her done. They put me on Pitocin and it took another couple of hours for it to do anything. But it worked and I started progressing, thankfully, because if I wasn't going to start progressing past 3, I would have had to have a C-section. When it came time, they checked me and they're like, okay, you can start pushing. I'm on a full block epidural. I've got a catheter in and I can't feel anything. I haven't been able to eat. I've only just been able to sleep because I got the epidural, and I was a mess. And they're like, okay, it's time to start pushing. And I was like, push what? Full block epidural. I can't feel a thing. And they're like, start pushing the baby out. And I'm like, how? And they're like, what do you mean? How? Like, push like you have to poop, right? That's what they always say. Push like you have to poop. And I go, I can't do that. I can't feel anything. I don't even have an asshole at this point. It is. And so they take me off my epidural, they like stop it. And I just immediately start vomiting. And they're like, I keep getting like yelled at almost to like push. And like I had no time to like process the transition of being fully dilated into, bringing my baby earth side. And I think my mom said I had pushed for 4 hours. They did a failed vacuum attempt where they took like this plunger and like put it on her and like were trying to pull her out. And that didn't work. They said that she was sunny side up. So the biggest part of her head was trying to come out first. They had it was a teaching hospital. So they had like students coming in and I'm like playing tug of war with them. They put a bar on my bed and I'm like bracing myself and like, they did everything. Everything but let me stand up, let me go on all fours. They didn't let me change position. I had remained on my back the entire time I was in labor because I didn't know any different. There was just no transparency. There was no communication. There was no education or guidance. I didn't know what a doula was. I didn't know what a midwife was and like what the difference between a midwife and an OB was. I had my mom and I had my mom's experiences. And it was really hard. I had torn really badly, but I was able to, successfully have a vaginal birth. And, I did it. And that's what mattered to me. I thought I was okay. I had stayed in the hospital a couple of days and then they sent me on my way. And I was left with the baby. And then by the time she was just a year old when we had found out we were pregnant with my son. I got pregnant with him. I go, okay, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to find a midwife and I'm going to have a natural birth. And I'm not even going to go to a hospital. I was so mad at the hospital for its lack of communication and their lack of education and resources. And, it just felt so violent and it felt so abusive and it felt just so wrong. And so I knew I didn't want to go through that again. So I had found a midwife in the Olympia area. And I had planned a birth center. Didn't even know that existed before I met, this service. And I was so excited. I was going to have this beautiful, all natural water birth. It was going to be everything I wanted. The appointments were still, just come in, come out, do your labs, and it is what it is. It was just an in and out experience. There was still not much education that went into it. They're like, oh yeah, to have a birth center birth, you have to take a birthing class. But here's a free one online, right? And I didn't take a birthing class with my daughter, didn't even know what it was. And I was like, I'd already given birth once. I'm fine. What do I need to know? But my partner, he didn't get to experience the birth of my daughter. And so he, went to this little online class, and, he just clicked through buttons, and it was just, pre-worded out pages of, deep breaths and do squats and walk a lot. And it was nothing actually legitimately educational. But one thing I forgot to mention with my daughter, I had gone overdue. I had went past my due date. And I was 8 days overdue. I actually ended up having her the day before my induction date. So with my son, that happens again. Due date comes, due date goes. And I'm like, what's happening? He's not coming. And just like my daughter, he just wouldn't drop. He was not ready, maybe. But since my daughter was OP, they were concerned about him being OP. And since I had group B or whatever it was called the first time, I also had it the second time. And so with this birth, they go, okay, you go overdue. We know you go overdue. We can let you go to 41 weeks, but then, we need to do an induction. So I was like, okay, 40 weeks came, 40 weeks went. I ended up being able to get an ultrasound of my placenta to see how healthy it was. And so I carried until 11 days after my due date. And I go into an appointment with my midwife, and she goes, okay, do you want to get induced? And I was like, yeah, let's do this. Let's have a baby. Mind you, I don't know the progress I had experienced. I didn't know if I was effaced or if I was dilated or what. But from what I've now heard, it had to have been something, because she breaks my water and then tells me to go take a walk. And that's how we induced labor. And I go with my partner, and we're walking around the neighborhood. We go get lunch, and we go to Target, and we make sure that the last things are taken care of. And, I get to still be with my daughter, who was, just a toddler. And getting lunch made me really excited. I was like, heck yeah, I get to go in this, having a meal. Food is very important to me. And so it was very important for my labor experience. And I'm walking and I'm walking and I'm walking. And she goes, come back every 2 hours so we can do an IV drip. Because I had to get antibiotics for the group B thing. And that's exactly what we did. We walked around for 2 hours. We went back. She's like, hey, how you doing? I was like, I'm good. And she would check me, and she goes, no progress. By about 8 hours or so in, she puts me on a breast pump, and she has me drink cotton stuff to try and get contractions going. Because I'm having contractions, but they are not consistent whatsoever. I was still having just a lot of back cramping, but not a lot of full real contractions that, you always hear about in the stories of oh, I'm having contractions. That never really happened, even with my water being broken. And there was a staircase inside of the birth center, and we're walking up and down the stairs, and I'm doing lunges and squats and all these things, and I start getting tired. It's been a long day, and so she starts the tub, even though I'm only at 3 centimeters, magic number, 3 centimeters. And that's what I was at, and that's what I stayed at. And by 12 hours, my IV had what's it called when the blood thickens and you can't she couldn't flush it at that point. She would have had to have done a whole new IV. And I was still only at 3.5 centimeters, and I'm having painful contractions, but they're not consistent. And she was telling me, I think he might have rotated to be OP instead of being the correct way or whatever. And so she transferred me after 13 hours to the hospital, the same hospital that I gave birth to, or I gave birth in with my daughter. And I was just devastated, truly, truly devastated. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to do it. I felt like my world was shattering around me. I had sat on the front porch calling my mom in tears, this is what they're doing to me. Just really feeling sorry for myself, and rightfully so, because I deserved a good birth. And so I go to the hospital, and I get transferred, and they set me up, and they get everything hooked up to me, and they're doing, what's going on. And my midwife tells them what's going on, and then she leaves. She just leaves me. And I thought she would have stayed there to help support me, because she was my primary, care person, as I was, in my pregnancy, and that wasn't the case. It was just me and my partner, and we were all alone in the hospital. They had hooked me up to an epidural immediately as soon as I got there, per my midwife's recommendation, so I could sleep, but also because they wanted to try and rotate the baby, because they had thought that my son had, flipped to be the wrong direction. They put a peanut between my legs, and that was it. And then the nurses left, and it was just me and my partner. And I did get to sleep. I didn't get to eat. I didn't get to do anything. I had no comfort. We had no hospital bags packed. So my mom and my partner were swapping out, trying to get things taken care of. And then at one point, we're both asleep in the room, and I wake up to 12 nurses surrounding me, an oxygen mask being put on my face. The monitor was turned away from me, and I'm just what's going on? And nobody would tell me. And they're just hold on, hold on, hold on. And they're we need to rotate you, and we need to move you. And I'm what's going on? And they won't tell me. So I'm being surrounded by a bunch of nurses. Nobody will tell me what's going on, but all hands are on deck. And they're feeling my belly, and they're using, their stethoscope things, and doing all sorts of stuff. And I'm just what is going on? Talk to me, tell me. My partner wakes up, and he comes over, and he's what's going on? And nobody's telling him either. And again, with the same hospital, not communicating. And eventually they told me we had lost the baby's heartbeat, after they had found it. And I was why wouldn't you have told me that? And there's speculation that maybe the monitor had just fallen off, or maybe, he was in distress. We don't know. They didn't tell us anything. They didn't, have a moment of, okay, let's take in what just happened. That wasn't a thing. And I must have gone back to sleep or something. But hours go in, and I'm progressing because they put me on the Pitocin, and it was time to push. And so I'm getting ready to push, and my partner is saying, "Oh my gosh, he has so much hair." And so he's right there, and they tell me, "You have to have a C-section." And I'm like, "Why?" And they're like, "Well," and I don't remember ever getting like a legitimate, straightforward answer as to why I have to get a C-section. I think it was because like there was a dip in his heart rate, or there was some like a lip of my cervix still left, and so he was stuck, I guess, because there was just a little bit of the cervix left, and I couldn't have delivered him with that there. And she goes, "I'm trying to, push it away or whatever, but it's not going anywhere. It's not dissolving. And so you have to have a C-section." There were no other options. There was no other, I had no choice but to get a C-section, because they really made it out to be like this was a life or death situation. And so before I knew it, I'm calling my mom again, hysterically crying. "This isn't what I want. This isn't, the plan." And I go in for a C-section. During the C-section, nobody tells me what's going on. But I vividly remember them saying, "You're going to feel us pinching, and then you're not going to feel us pinching because we had put the medicine in," or something like that. Or, "You shouldn't feel us pinching." And I go, "But I can feel you pinching." And they go, "No, you can't." And I go, "Yes, I can. I can feel you pinching." And like the anesthesiologist is standing right behind my head, and I go, "I can feel it. I can feel it." And he goes, "It's okay. It'll go away in a second." And then immediately they cut into me and I blacked out. And my partner who was with me said that I had just passed out. I was throwing up and shaking violently, and I had lost consciousness. The anesthesiologist must have given me something. I wake back up, and I'm feeling just a lot of tugging and a lot of pulling, but beyond the tugging and pulling, like it hurt, like it legitimately caused physical pain to me. And then, my son was born. They hold him up, they drop the curtain. And I remember the midwife was just like, "Oh my God," because he was so big. He was so, so big. And they give him to his dad. And they said that I started hemorrhaging. And so they rushed the baby and his dad out of the room. They just push him out. They're like, "She's hemorrhaging, you gotta go." And I had lost consciousness. I didn't know this until after the fact, but nobody, after he had left the room, nobody told him anything. He didn't know if I was okay. He didn't know if I was still alive. He didn't know if the bleeding was under control. He knew nothing other than he had been given a brand new baby and just left in the post-op room. He said it took an hour for them to tell him that I was coming, back to be with him and the baby. As they were putting me together and I was like in and out of consciousness, I remember a nurse coming in and she goes, "He's 10 pounds. I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she goes, "You had a 10-pound baby." And I go, I don't think so." He goes, "Yes, you had a 10-pound baby." I was like, no, you got the wrong person. They put me back together. And I go into post-op, and it's, they give me my son, and he's a big dude. He is a 10-pound baby. He was 10 pounds, 0.06 ounces. And he was huge. He was so big. And everybody just told me there was no way you could have had him naturally. There was no way you could have done him, and it was so hard coping with not having the water birth that I wanted, and not having a natural birth, and like ending up in a hospital, and then like ending up with a C-section. It was just so, so, so difficult. And then when we go into our room afterwards, the lactation consultant comes in and she goes, there's no way you're going to be able to feed that baby. We'll get a breast pump for you. And I go, no, I don't want a pump. I want to breastfeed him, because with my daughter, I only did it for a couple of weeks and then I stopped because I had no idea what I was doing. With him, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it for as long as I can, baby steps, but I am determined to nurse my child. And so she goes, okay, do what you want to do, but you're not going to be able to produce enough milk for him. Little does she know, I had a really fast letdown and I had a great milk supply. I was able to nurse him for 6 months. But a part of my, the postpartum was there was no support. Nobody told me how to heal from a C-section. They didn't even give me a support band in the hospital. I got that from my midwife at a follow-up appointment. They didn't tell me, how the bleeding was going to be. It was just nothing. It was in and out. They could have cared less that I had a super traumatic C-section. And when we were in the hospital, we stayed for 5 days because I ended up getting an infection. So we stayed. And everybody just kept coming in, all these different nurses from all these different places. And they're like, oh, you're the mama with the 10-pound baby. We were some sort of spectacle or whatever. And they're like, yeah, there's no way you could have had him vaginally. And every time somebody said that, it was just reopening, the wound in my heart of I was somehow less than or incapable as a woman to have my child. Naturally, it was so hard for me to process and so difficult. And it's a big reason why I waited to have my next child. It took years to process, with Caden. And then when I had my son, Caden, learning more about what went wrong with my daughter, Salem. And, just processing and healing and, understanding what went wrong. And so with my third pregnancy, which was a huge surprise, I knew I wanted a midwife of color, and I'm going to try this again. And I was going to try for, another water birth. And this midwife was so helpful. We didn't have quick appointments like I was used to. We had an hour to each other where I really got to sit and process what my last 2 births were. I was older this time around. I was 26, 25, 26, when I got pregnant with my daughter, and I had a better understanding of how to advocate for myself and what birth trauma looks like and how it affected me and how it affected my children. And I just, I processed all of that with her, and I told her everything and how it all happened. And, she educated me on, they should have done this, they should have done that, that shouldn't have happened. And, this isn't okay and this isn't acceptable. And then much later in my pregnancy, I had gotten introduced with a new opportunity from my school as a work study student with Canoe Journey Herbalists. And from Canoe Journey Herbalists, I met Rhonda and, Center for Indigenous Midwiferys, and started even talking more in depthly about my births and just really hearing that's not okay and that's not normal and that shouldn't be, that's not going to be the case this time around. My midwife had hyped me up so hard on we're going to have this, badass VBAC, vaginal after cesarean, and it's going to be a home birth. We had planned for a home water birth, and she goes, I understand that you go overdue, so we're going to induce you early because we don't want the baby to be too big. And, she also let me know that another part of inducing was we didn't want to have more risks added on to a VBAC and, make me less of a candidate for a successful VBAC. And that was my biggest thing, was I didn't want a repeat C-section. And it kind of felt like there was just so much at play that could no longer qualify me for an at-home birth, and that I would have to be a transfer again to a hospital for a C-section. And so, but she wanted to induce me by like 36 weeks. And I said, well, let's wait for 37 weeks because, let's give baby a little bit more time. I didn't know what the induction, like she said, we're going to induce labor, we're going to get things going. We're going to get things going. And leading up to it, she's like, your body's so ready. You got this. I was having, contractions here and there, but nothing too, rhythmic. There was no pattern to them. And, so we're getting ready, she was just going to do a membrane sweep, but she goes, but this will really get your body going and, kickstart things. And it didn't happen. Her births were kind of stacking up on each other. And at this point, I was having like Braxton Hicks. Again, it was nothing consistent, no pattern, but I was having contractions and they kind of really sucked. There was a lot of pressure down there and I just felt like everything was going to fall out at any moment. And I was just so uncomfortable and I was so tired and I was like so scared of having to have another C-section. And it just kept getting put off that by the time it came to do it, there was like I felt like there was weird tension between me and my midwife and things got really emotional and things got really weird and kind of messy. But all that aside, the point was I was going to have a VBAC. I was not going to have another C-section. But 37 weeks turned into 38 weeks and it turned into 39 weeks and the membrane sweeps were only doing so much. My body was not going into labor. And the biggest thing was my baby yet again was not dropping. She would not drop. I was doing acupuncture. I was seeing a chiropractor. I was doing squats. I was going on hikes. I was doing everything that everybody told me to do. There were even times I went into my midwife's office so we could do like the breast pump and some cotton and just doing everything we can. And the baby would not drop. She just wouldn't do it. And so 41 weeks come and I'm in my appointment and I go, this is the inevitable. I have to go to a hospital. Because for me, it was my only way of thinking like this was how, at this point, I can only have a safe VBAC if I'm at a hospital because the baby's not dropping. And so she agreed. She goes, I'm glad you brought it up before I did, because I felt it in my heart that it was going to end up this way. But she knew an OB who was supportive of VBACs, and she'd worked with her before, and she had, they'd known each other, they knew each other, so it worked. But it was up in Tacoma, which is about like a 45-minute drive from where I live. And she calls her up and she looks at me and she goes, "Okay, can you be there in an hour?" An hour? I gotta figure out where to, like, I'm scrambling. I'm having to figure out where I'm going for my two kids, like where my two older children are going, because everybody's at work. And we have nothing packed. And so I'm like throwing stuff into a suitcase. I'm having, my partner take the kids over to my parents and we're scrambling to get things together. It was very underpacked. And we had to like hit the ground running to get up to Tacoma to have this baby. Because essentially what happened was she goes, "Okay, you're going to get induced." I had gone into the appointment with high blood pressure. I had always teetered on having high blood pressure throughout my pregnancy. But this time, we were going to use it as a way of getting induced that day. They were like, "Oh, you've got high blood pressure. Let's get you induced." And so like we did the transfer from, my midwife to this OB in Tacoma. And, she was like, eat some like Chick-fil-A on the way there, get that sodium in there because I was so sensitive to it during my pregnancy. And by the time I had my last blood pressure check with my midwife before leaving out the door, it was actually pretty high. And so she goes, okay, we're getting induced. So I make it up to Tacoma and I'm getting checked out by this midwife and getting, my care established before heading to the hospital. And she does yet another last membrane sweep. And she goes, don't move. And I was like, why? She goes, I'm pretty sure I felt fingers. And I was like, I was freaked out. I didn't understand what it meant, but it was like the baby had her hand on her head. And so I text my midwife and my midwife goes, oh, that's probably why she didn't drop. And they transfer me to the hospital. I'm at Tacoma General. I've never been there before, didn't even know it existed. But it was rad. It was so great. I come in and they're telling me everything that they're doing. We're putting this one on for the hearts and this one on for the contractions. And we are starting an IV to give you a little bit of fluids, but we're also going to be able to put the Pitocin in. Like they are describing each and every step that they are doing, which I've never had before. We are waiting on my midwife to show up because I had asked my midwife to be present. I still wanted her for my birth. And kind of like act as my doula with it being in a pandemic. I was still allowed to support people. And I knew that I didn't want to be the sole decision maker of this birth. I didn't want to be in another situation where I have to make spur of the moment decisions. And so having my midwife there who knew my whole story and all of my care, and my partner there, they were able to kind of like team up with each other and support me through the birth. It was so great too, because my midwife was like, can she have her last meal? And the nurse was like, no, she can't eat now. She's in the hospital. And the OB comes in and she goes, no, get her some food. And I always get laughed at, but that was the most exciting part for me. It was like, oh my gosh, I get to eat in labor. I had like a grilled cheese sandwich. And I had like chicken noodle soup and they were giving me drinks and I got to eat and drink and do all of the great things my entire labor. Because they were both with Salem and Caden. I cried. I was so thirsty. They're like, nope, you get ice. But at this hospital, they were letting me eat. They were letting me drink. Oh, it was glorious. It was so great. And my nurses were women of color. At the hospitals in Olympia, it was all white nurses. And at Tacoma, I was able to have, Mexican and Black nurses and not just have all of my, care team be just white women. It was so great. One of the nurses, we were just like hanging out and making conversation, and like my midwife and her were talking about midwifery, and I was just vibing, eating my food, and it was so great and it was so comfortable. And they told us everything that they did when they came in and why they were doing it and why it was necessary. And they're checking my monitor and I'm having contractions. I'm having constant contractions. And like, I vividly remember the nurse looking at me and she goes, girl, you can't feel these? I was like, no, like I am fully convinced I'm not in labor. And she goes, oh no, homegirl, you are in labor. And my midwife takes a look at it and she goes, those are very consistent contractions. I was like, nah. Mind you, when they were setting up the Pitocin, she's like, 16 is like the sweet spot. Like, oh God, that seems awful. They started me at 1 and it made the baby's heart rate like dip. I stayed at 0.5 on my Pitocin my entire labor. When I transferred, I was already at a 5, which is farther than I had made it with my other 2 births before being transferred. But it took a couple of hours. I went in the tub and things were getting really bad, really painful. My water hadn't broke yet though, which was super cool. the doctor at the time comes in and he goes, I'm going to do a check on you to see if, you're ready to have your water broken. He went to do the check and my water broke at that moment, which was the first time my water naturally broke. Well, like my daughter's, it was like a premature rupture, they called it. But this, it felt like the moment that you see on TV. I was like, my water broke. It was super cool. Um, and so much fluid came out. And my midwife goes, this is not going to be a big baby. What do you mean? And she goes, that is a lot of fluid. That belly was all fluid. And after my water broke, it was pain I had never felt in my life. With my last two, it was labor pains, but this was unimaginable. Like I felt like my pubic bone was going to shatter in half. And it wasn't any of the back pain. Everybody had prepared me for more back pain. I had bought like a TENS unit with me, and we were so ready, and that was not the case. It was just my pubic bone feeling like it was going to shatter into a million pieces. Oh, it was wild. So I get in the tub and like everybody's, doing the pressure points and helping me and doing all this stuff. And it was quite a few hours of that. And, my midwife is advocating for me on like what I want and what I need. And, we're also kind of figuring out a game plan. And I go, if they check me and I'm still at 5.5, I need an epidural, because at that point I was fighting my contractions and I was tensing up and I was getting really like, it wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for baby. And I knew I needed to rest. And so I made the decision to get an epidural that time. I made the plan that like, this is going to be how it is. And they checked me, and surely enough, I hadn't progressed. And so I go, cool, say less, let's get an epidural. The anesthesiologist comes in and he's telling me, this is the adhesive and this is the needle and this is what the needle looks like. And he's like showing it all to me. And I was like, okay, again, with the communication and the education and me feeling very in the loop of my decision. But what was even more crazy to me was they go, we're not going to give you a catheter. We'll just come in with like a Foley, and we'll empty a bladder, every so often. We don't need to keep a catheter in. And after the epidural was done and I got situated into bed, I was like, I can still feel my legs. And they're like, yeah. I was like, that's okay. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. And I was just so amazed. I was like, but I can still drink. The OB who is, taking over my care, she said, clear stuff essentially was rule. So like Jello, I could still have applesauce. I could still have like ginger ale and water and stuff like that on an epidural. And I was like, this is awesome. I could still feel my legs. I wasn't hooked up to a catheter. And I could still feel my my contractions, but they weren't horrific. Right before I got in the epidural, just in the moment to take the edge off before the anesthesiologist came, I had gotten a very, very, very low dose of pain medication because of my experience with Salem. I didn't want anything too hardcore. And so they told me what the medication was. They told me the dosage, and they told me the dosage that they could do for me. It was a very, I felt very included and very in control of the situation and my decision to get pain reliever before the epidural was able to be given to me. I had napped and I was just hanging out and letting my Pitocin and epidural do its thing. It still never went over 0.5. If it got up too high, my baby's heart rate kept dipping. And so they just kept dropping it. And, my midwife went home and took a shower and, got things worked out. And then a couple of hours later, and I truly can't remember how long all of this was. But, she comes back after, that my partner and I had taken like a really good nap. She had gotten a nap in. And the OB came in and she was like, oh, you're at 8 centimeters. And my midwife said she'd come back at 8 centimeters. So I texted her and I go, okay, it's time for her to come back. And so at 8 centimeters, we had specifically waited for my midwife to come back so she could be with me, I'm pretty sure. But she shows up and then my OB comes in and it gets really intense. I had known beforehand that this was going to be a possibility, which was another deciding factor of me getting an epidural. I'm at 8 centimeters. My water's broken, and baby was slightly shifting to an OP position. So she goes and she grabs the baby's head and she rotates her and holds her into the correct position, finishes dilating me to 10, and like the baby's like ascending or whatever. I don't know the technical terms for it, but she does all of that and it's super intense and crazy and wild. And then she leaves. My OB left the room and I'm like, as she brought the baby down, I was pushing, and then so like baby's right there and she leaves the room and I'm like, I'm still pushing. And the nurse is like, stop pushing, stop pushing. She's like yelling at me. Baby's head's right there. They have a mirror at the end of my bed, so I could actually watch, which was wild. And my midwife is on one side and my partner is on the other side. And she's like, stop pushing, stop pushing. And I look at my midwife, I'm like, I'm not going to stop pushing. And so I keep pushing, and the nurse is running around screaming at people, like opening their door, and she's like, and she's like making calls on her cell phone, and she's like, where's the OB? And we got to get NICU in here, because I guess there was so much meconium in there when my daughter was born, so much meconium, and so they're like, we need to get NICU in here. And I'm like, I'm kind of like freaking out at this point. I was like, oh my God, this is happening. And my midwife is like, you're going to do it. You're going to have your VBAC and it's going to be awesome. And like right in the nick of time, everybody comes in and I have my daughter and they put her on my chest, which never happened with my son. And it never happened with my first daughter. They put the baby on me and I'm able to like be with her and I'm freaking out. She is tiny, tiny, tiny little baby. And I cannot get over how small she was. And they, despite all the meconium and them really wanting to check her out, they let her dad cut her umbilical cord, which was super special to us. And then, they take her away and do the stuff. And I'm just like bawling my eyes out. I'm like, I did it. I had my VBAC. And despite it not being the plan of like an at-home birth, it was everything a hospital birth should have been. It was everything that I had hoped for in the instance of not having what I had hoped for, it was great. It was awesome. It was so special and so wonderful and so great. And it's one of those things, with my daughter, I was like, oh, I was going to have another baby. And with my son, I'm like, I'm definitely not having another baby. But, after Lane was born, I had a November 30th of this year. She's a brand new baby. I'm like, heck yeah, let's do this again. And so it was great. It was awesome. It was everything it should have been. And so, yeah, those are my 3 babies' births.
Thanks, Aiyana.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really sweet to just hear all your stories all connected. And, I've had conversations with you, but just being able to hear, all the birth stories that you're holding in your body now. I have a few just questions for you. Like, if you were back and in that first pregnancy and know what you know now, what would you wish for yourself, or what do you wish for other people who are beginning this journey for the first time? and trying to find their way?
I wish I'd known that doulas were an option, like an accessible option. And I would have, I wish for everybody to advocate for yourself. Do not let anybody oppress your voice and your birth experience because it's an inconvenience on them. Like, you stand your ground and you be the strong mama that you are, and you get what you want out of your birth.
And how about for just lactation, breastfeeding, and in preparing for postpartum?
Lactation's a big one because, with my daughter, I didn't do it successfully because I didn't know. And then with my son, I only did it for 6 months because I had gone back to work. And so I think it's really important to know that, like, I was under this preconceived idea that lactation came naturally, that it's something you just know how to do. And it's like, no, you have to learn how to do it. You and your baby both have to work together and learning how to do that, and like normalizing getting help. Not from like the hospital lactation people, because they're very like, they're kind of violent with how they go about it. They just grab baby and they grab you and they shove you guys together. But knowing what your resources are and not feeling ashamed because you don't know what you're doing, because none of us know what we're doing.
True story.
And then postpartum, the same thing, nobody knows what you're doing. I wish postpartum doulas were more common and accessible and like normalized, because everybody tells you, oh my gosh, when baby's born, I'm going to be there and I'm bringing you food. And then like for us, that never happened. We never got support. We never got, a little bit of a helping hand. And so being able to say, I need a moment, somebody take this baby so I can go cry in the shower, and letting that be okay.
Mm-hmm. What would you say, just because I feel like the advice you just gave is just really appropriate for anyone starting their journey? Would you give anything more specific, or have any other wishes specifically for Indigenous parents?
For Indigenous parents, I feel like there's a lot of just inherited, like, generational traumas when it comes to birthing naturally, holistically, and parenting in the ways that we've done since time immemorial. And advocating for, no, I want traditional medicines included in my birth, and you're not going to tell me no. Or accepting, for me, it was so demonized, especially with nursing. It was very uncommon to nurse. And I was like, no, this is what my ancestors did, and this is what my family did, and this is natural and safe for my baby. Co-sleeping is what we have always done. Extended breastfeeding and nursing without covering your body. These are what our ancestors did, and this was sustainable to them. And in your own way and on your own time, coming to terms with, decolonizing the damaging effects that have been put upon us when it comes to how we raise our children or be in community with our babies. And, just really embracing being a powerful Indigenous birthing person who comes from a long line of strong Indigenous women who fought so hard and did it for so many years, and that it's okay and it's acceptable, and you're not doing anything wrong by doing it the way your ancestors did it. Yeah.
How about just community building as an Indigenous family? Like, I'm just thinking, so I'll just share, Aiyana recently taught a ribbon skirt class for pregnant and parenting families. And it was just so sweet to see how, people need a space talk about what they're going through as new parents, as pregnant people, to talk about their birth stories or their relationship dramas, or, whatever that is. And doing that around, Native crafts was added this next level, to, we're literally, creating a path for us, to raise our children with these values and these teachings. And so I just wanted to see if you wanted to speak to that at all, as far as, how to find community and, people with shared values, and, to parent and raise your children in the way that you dream of for them.
Yeah. A big part for me in my journey in finding community, this is new to me. I didn't have community with my son or my first two children. And realizing that as an Indigenous parent, bringing your children with you everywhere you go is not a burden or a hindrance on like what you're capable of doing or who you are or what you're trying to do. Childcare is hard. It's also really inaccessible. But I also want to have my babies with me. And so everywhere I go, I bring my babies with me. And that's a part of community, is letting go of the guilt of like, oh, my kids are a burden. Like, no, your kids are community. Your kids need community just as much as you do. And for finding community, it was hard. It was so hard for me to find community. But it was through Center for Indigenous Midwifery and getting involved with, the side project of Canoe Journey Herbalist, which I got involved with from school. But being involved with like all the opportunities Rhonda puts out there, introduced me to so many people that I now, hold so dearly in my heart. And so like, if you find yourself in a position where, you're like, oh, I heard about this thing, just do it. Ask about it, especially when it's like someone like me where I just don't stop talking about it. I'll be like, hey, go hang out with us. Don't be afraid to ask to be included, because more than likely we would love, to expand our community, but we know that it's hard to ask, but we also don't want to overstep boundaries of, inviting everybody in. But it's it's a work in progress, especially in like, a late stage pandemic, where people are learning to let go and like let their babies be with people, is a lot. But seeing what's out in your community and what like my midwife that I went to with my last daughter has like parenting circles, which I never knew was a thing, which is just so wild and amazing to me. And yeah.
What about specifically lactation support? Just I know you're inspired and trying to support people that get the support they need. What wishes do you have to put forward?
Don't be afraid to ask. I mean, even with my daughter that I just had, we've had a really hard time with her latching, and I never really got, I was, my midwife was going to give me, lactation support or like phone numbers for people. And it didn't happen because she got busy and I didn't want to follow up because I was like, oh, I don't want to feel needy. Just do it. Advocate for yourself, advocate for you, advocate for your baby. And, there's nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed about when it comes to needing support. And from what I've seen, they love helping you. I've met, a couple of amazing lactation support people, and they're just like, yeah, let's talk about this. And it's so wonderful. And it makes you feel so valid.
Okay. Well, any closing thoughts, Aiyana? And then, yeah, thank you. So someone just wrote, for those who can't read this, to just, thank you for being so open with your birth stories. While a lot of these Zoomcasts are, people who are sharing specific topics or crafts, it's also just really important to just hear birth stories and how unique and different, and how you learn a little bit more, and what you wished and what you learned, and the hard parts and the happy parts, and to just take that all in. So I definitely just thank you for your openness, and for, just sharing. You have quite a variety of experiences that you just put forward, and it's so valuable to hear and to learn from real people who are, birthing right now, and have such just, fresh, insights on, the the way modern birth is right now, and so I thank you. I thank you for all that, just like the person in the chat also commented. So yeah, any other closing thoughts, Aiyana? Feel free to advertise your business too, if you like.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and for hearing my birth stories. It really is a very healing experience just talking about it. I had only just really started telling my story, and it does a lot of healing in hearing other people who are, I went through the same thing, or I had my perfect birth. Birth is birth, and everybody's unique and different. And I'm slowly learning to surrender to not planning it, and being less of a control freak about it, and letting it run its natural course. And so I'm thankful for everybody who listens to me and hears my stories. And I love talking about babies and births so much. Like Rhonda said, I do beadwork, beaded by Salish on Instagram. I do a lot of like lanyards and earrings and other goodies to help sustain my family. So yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you so much.